Hey, what's up guys? I'm Greg, you're watching the Car Passion channel. What I'm going to be showing you is how to depower your power steering rack. Now there are a couple different ways to get rid of the power steering in your Miata. The easiest way obviously is to just take the belt off, or a lot of people take the whole power steering system out and they just loop the lines on the steering rack. But the problem with both of those methods is you're still pushing the fluid around inside the rack and it can make the steering more difficult, a little bit more sluggish. So today what I'm going to be showing you is how to remove the rack from your Miata, how to completely disassemble it, and what internal modifications you need to make it a true manual rack. A lot of people are probably going to be asking, well, can't I just get a manual rack from a Miata that never had power steering and swap it into my car? Yes, absolutely. And if you're not comfortable with disassembling your steering rack, then that's the way I recommend. But there's one major advantage to depowering the rack. The Miata's power steering rack actually has a faster ratio than the OEM manual rack, and what that means is for a certain amount that you turn the steering wheel, a car with a power rack will steer a little bit quicker or a little bit more. A lot of people prefer that over the OEM manual rack, especially those autocrossers, canyon carvers, or just anyone that likes spirited driving like myself. When I'm autocrossing or running canyons, even in the tightest hairpins, I never have to go more than 180 degrees, which means I never have to take my hands off the steering wheel, and I really enjoy that. That's personally why I prefer just depowering a power rack. In my main Miata, I've already got all the power steering equipment removed, but I still have an unmodified power rack inside the car, and I really want to get that thing nice and buttered up before I get the new engine in there. So if you're riding dirty with just an unmodified power rack in your car, you're really going to like this modification. I highly recommend it. What do you say we get to it? You have to remove the splash guard to get the rack out. And for all the people that have asked where my blow-off valve is, right down here by the radiator, sleeper style. Next thing is to loosen up the clamp on the steering shaft. Now this is the view from above. It's just this bolt right here, it's 12 millimeter. Now I'm going to disconnect the outer tie rods from the inner tie rods. I got my crescent wrench on there nice and snug, and now I'm just going to put a 17 millimeter on the smaller nut. If this nut is super tight, you can set your wrenches up like this and use the strength in your hands to squeeze them together. To make sure I install the rack about the same way it came out, I'll unthread that nut all the way and then use a paint pen to mark these threads. Now you should get in alignment if you pull the rack and put it back in your car, but this should get you pretty close to lined up so you can drive. Now as I'm unthreading the inner tie rod from the outer tie rod with a 12 millimeter wrench, you can see where the paint stopped, and I know exactly how far to thread it back in when I reinstall the rack. Now we're ready to unbolt the rack from the subframe, and on each side you've got a bracket that has two 14 millimeter bolts in it. The rack's cleaned up a little bit, and the next thing I'm going to do is remove the dust shield. I'm going to be removing the inner tie rod from the rack itself. So you have a flat washer right here, and it's got these little flaps on it that fold over to help prevent the inner tie rod from coming loose. What you have to do is get a little flathead or a punch and a hammer and just kind of hit these until the tabs fold up. You can see that one tab there has now been folded back, and you got to do the same to the other three sides. Now it's time to unthread the inner tie rod from the rack, and those things can be pretty tight. So put a big old crescent wrench on the rack itself. I'm going to flip it just like that. Now just repeat the same exact process for the other side. Remove this universal joint with another 12 millimeter bolt. I need a new one of these too, thanks to my little engine bay incident. Now I'm going to relieve the tension from the pinion, which you want to start with this large nut right here. This thing can actually be super tight, so if you get a secure fit on it and then just tap the wrench with a hammer. Throw a 14 millimeter on the adjuster. And it's always a good idea when you're pulling things apart to keep them in order. If you have them all laid out nice, then you'll have a better chance of reassembling it correctly. Loosen up the bolt on the bottom of the pinion with a 21mm. Underneath that, you've got a 17mm. And you've got a little dust shield here that just comes right off, as well as a really dirty snap ring. Now, the pinion is free. And this bearing in here sometimes will be all rusted out and really crusty when you spin it. If you want to replace this bearing, I've actually found them at bicycle shops. There are some bicycle hubs that use the same exact bearing. So if you bring it in, you can probably find what you're looking for. And it's actually not very difficult to replace at all. You can see I can just pull this out. I don't even have to hammer on it or anything. Come up to the side of the rack opposite the pinion, and you'll see a little clip inside here. First time I did this, I spent about 30 minutes trying to get this clip out before I realized that Mazda was smart enough to put a little hole here that you push a screwdriver into and it pops the clip right out. Just get the flathead in there and you can pop the end of the clip up. So just pop it right out. Now just pull on the rack itself. Slide that part off. The final part of the disassembly process is just to pull out this inner shaft from the rack. So now that you just have this big pile of dirty parts, clean out all the grit, all the grease. You almost need dental floss to get the grease out of these teeth here. You just want it to be as clean as possible. We're going to be putting fresh grease in the teeth, and it's going to be nice and buttery when we're done. Okay, now this is what we really came in here to do. What you have on this shaft is a seal, and this seal separates the pressure of hydraulic fluid between the left and right sides of the rack. The pinion inside of a power rack has what's called a rotary valve, and depending on which way you steer the steering wheel, it's going to send pressure to the left side or the right side of the rack. If the hydraulic pressure goes to this side of the rack, it's going to help you steer this way, and if it goes to this side of the rack, it's going to help you steer this way. That's why this seal is very important in a power rack. But since we're not going to have hydraulic fluid and pressure and all that, all this seal is doing is causing drag when you're trying to steer left and right. So we're going to chop it off. There's the end result, no more seal, and now it's time to put it back together. I'm just going to take some generic grease here and get it all in the teeth. I also like to put just a really light coating on the entire thing, and same with the pinion. Now you're ready to slide this back in. It can be a little bit difficult to find the exact center of the seal that's down in here. Don't force it in, it will go in if it's centered. Next up is this end piece, also with a light layer of grease on it. You can also put the clip back in here. Oh my god, there's so much grease on the camera. Now you can drop the pinion back in and replace the top snap ring. It might be kind of hard to see, but this is resting up on top of that ridge there. And what you can do is just take a flathead and tap it lightly with a hammer, and it'll pop into place. And then just drop that little dust shield back on. Drop your bearing back in and reinstall the bottom nut. And the dust shield. This gets a little interesting. This is the piece that puts tension on the rack against the pinion. And if you make it too tight, the car will not steer freely. And if you make it too loose, there will be play in the steering. So you want to make sure it's adjusted right. Put this in first, along with its little washer. Put the spring in. This piece is how you adjust the tension. So the first thing I do is I take the lock ring all the way off and just install this. Now take your torque wrench and set it to 43 inch-pounds. That's 4.86 Newton meters for those in other countries. Torque the adjuster 3 times, which means you're going to turn it until the torque wrench clicks, and then do it 2 more times. Back it off 25 degrees, which is approximately a 1/16 of a turn. So this is a 1/4 of a turn, that's 90 degrees. That's an 1/8 of a turn, which is 45 degrees. So we're gonna go about to here. Right about there. Thread the lock ring on. Now this is really important. When you're tightening the lock ring, you have to hold the adjuster in place with the wrench so it doesn't spin as you tighten the ring. I still spin this, and mine was a little bit tense at first, so I backed this off a few more degrees until it felt better. Now I'm going to reinstall the outer tie rods, and the only thing that's really tricky about this is you have to make sure this square lock washer thing lines up here, otherwise you're not going to be able to hammer the tabs back over the edge straight. So I'll show you what I mean when I get it all back together. Now this square washer lines up properly so you can hammer these tabs back over the edge. Oh boy. We got a dog in the studio. Come here, let me see that ball. Oh, Jesus. We got a dog in the studio. Wild animal. Oh. Security breach. So this is how it should look when it's done. You can see this tab is bent over, and it's just like an additional safety feature. You could even use Loctite on that if you wanted to. And just a little side note, in case you're ever wondering where those rack spacers go that help you with drifting, they help you get more steering angle, it goes in between this and this. Remove your inner tie rod, you install the spacer right in here, and then you just put this back on and you got more angle for mad skids. Now throw on your boots. I went ahead and bought a new set because mine were torn to pieces. After you remove these lines, which just unthread, you're left with these holes, and dirt and dust will get through those holes and accumulate inside the rack if you just leave them open, which you don't want. Now there are a few ways to go about this. You can find the right size thread bolt and just put the right bolt into all these different holes, and that will help prevent the dust from getting in. I just like to take a dollop of this silicone sealant and just do that. It's like you're putting sour cream on a taco. Yeah, that's what it looks like when it's done. Not the cleanest, but super easy. Car's not going to be a show car, so I don't really care that much. And by the way, I don't put sour cream on my tacos with my finger, for the record. I don't know where that reference came from. Before you install the rack back in the car, you want to center it. There's a couple different ways to do it. One way is to make some measurements from the end of the inner tie rod into a certain part of the rack and make sure it's even on both sides. But I kind of like to do it the dummy way. So I stick this steering joint on here and steer it all the way to one side. And then I'm going to count how many turns it takes to get all the way to the other side, which I already know is 2 5/8. And now I know half of 2 5/8 is 1 5/16. And like I said, you can do degrees, you can do this a bunch of different ways, but you just want to make sure the rack is centered. So now I'm going to go 1 5/16 the other way. This is exactly how I'm going to install the rack back in the car. I still have the paint on the threads on the inner tie rod, so I can get the alignment pretty close. So putting this thing back in the car is the exact reverse of how it came out. There's nothing really tricky about it. And a job like this, it's dirty, it's time consuming, it's tedious, but if you're thinking about doing it yourself, hopefully this video gave you that little push from the nest, so to speak, to try this procedure. If you learned something today, if you want more technical videos, drop a like right here and let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I will see you in the next one. Peace out.
Back from the dead.